Hello and welcome back to Mindcast. I'm your host, Will. This is part 2 of our deep dive into the architectures of organizational failure. In our last episode, The Architecture of Chaotic Leadership, we explored a disruptive leadership model, one that intentionally manufactures chaos, demands absolute personal loyalty, and dismantles the very guardrails of an institution. These chaotic actors generate crises as a control mechanism, overwhelming systems with noise to achieve short-term wins, even if it guarantees long-term decay. Today, we're looking at the other side of the coin. What happens when these same chaotic actors encounter systems that are the complete opposite? Systems built not on chaos, but on good faith, fairness, and boundless tolerance.
Our guide for this journey is a dense but brilliant analysis called Systemic Vulnerabilities, which unpacks how bad actors exploit good faith, neutrality, and tolerance. Now, don't worry, we're not going to get bogged down in academic jargon. Instead, here's my promise to you. By the end of this episode, you will understand the single biggest design flaw in our modern institutions. You'll learn to spot how rules are weaponized, how neutrality is used as a shield, and most importantly, you'll walk away with a new framework for thinking about how to build stronger, more resilient organizations in your own life. This isn't just theory, this is the operating system of the world around us. So let's get into it.
This brings us to our first key insight, and it comes from the philosopher Karl Popper, writing in the ashes of World War II. He called it the paradox of tolerance. The idea is deceptively simple. If a tolerant society extends unlimited tolerance to everyone, including those who are fundamentally intolerant, then the intolerant will eventually seize control and destroy tolerance itself. To preserve a tolerant system, that system must, paradoxically, be intolerant of intolerance. This isn't just a theoretical puzzle, it's a historically proven reality. The clearest and most chilling example is the collapse of the Weimar Republic in Germany during the 1930s. Here was a government fiercely committed to liberal democracy. It gave absolute political tolerance to everyone, including extremist groups like Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party. The system assumed everyone was playing by the same democratic rules, but the Nazis weren't. They took those freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and used them as weapons to spread propaganda, intimidate their opponents, and systematically destroy the public's trust in the very institutions that protected them.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's a powerful historical example, but how does this apply today? Well, the same vulnerability that Popper identified in philosophy can be proven with cold, hard math. This is where game theory comes in. If you're not familiar with it, game theory is the study of mathematical models of strategic interaction among rational decision-makers, and one of its most famous scenarios, the prisoner's dilemma, perfectly explains why good faith is so easily exploited. Imagine two partners in crime, captured and held in separate cells. They can't communicate. The prosecutors offer each of them a deal, and here are the potential outcomes. If both stay silent, that is, they cooperate with each other, they both serve a short sentence. If one betrays the other, or defects, while the other stays silent, the defector goes free, and the silent one gets a massive sentence. This is the sucker's payoff. And if both betray each other, they both get a medium sentence. The rational choice, purely from self-interest, is always to betray your partner. That's the dilemma. When an organizational system mandates boundless tolerance, it essentially forces its participants to continually play cooperate regardless of their opponent's strategy. This creates a system ripe for exploitation. Game theorists have shown that a strategy of defection will ruthlessly exploit an opponent who is unconditionally willing to cooperate. The defector extracts maximum value right up until the point the cooperator gives up. The only mathematical way to sustain cooperation and prevent a total system collapse is to implement immediate consequences for bad faith.
Tolerating bad faith behavior just generates more of it. So if direct confrontation isn't the only way systems are attacked, how do bad actors operate? The analysis we're exploring today introduces a powerful metaphor, the organizational parasite. When actors want to dominate a system or extract value without contributing, they rarely launch a frontal assault. Instead, they exhibit parasitic behavior. In biology, an obligate parasite cannot complete its life cycle without exploiting a suitable host. It relies entirely on bypassing the host's immune defenses and utilizing the host's resources for its own survival. In organizational contexts, organizational parasites function identically.
They use deception, manipulation, and formal compliance to bypass the host's administrative defenses, mimicking legitimate participants while siphoning resources and creating dysfunction. And they do this by weaponizing the system's own ethical rules, bureaucratic procedures, and legal frameworks. One of the most clear-cut examples of this is in the legal system, through something called SLAPP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation. The judicial system operates on the foundational assumption that lawsuits are filed in good faith to seek redress for legitimate grievances. But bad faith actors systematically exploit this assumption.
A SLAPP suit is a meritless legal action brought by a powerful individual, corporation, or entity against critics, journalists, whistleblowers, or advocacy groups to dissuade them from continuing to produce negative publicity. The defining characteristic of a SLAPP suit is that the plaintiff does not actually expect to win the legal argument. Instead, the legal process itself is the intended punishment. The strategic goal is to censor, intimidate, and silence opposition by burdening the defendant with insurmountable legal costs, psychological exhaustion, and the imminent threat of financial ruin. By dragging critics through years of procedural motions, depositions, and discovery, the bad faith actor achieves their goal of silencing public participation regardless of the eventual verdict. A slap may also intimidate bystanders, causing a widespread chilling effect on free speech. This tactic is prevalent among highly resourced corporate entities and powerful individuals. For example, former U.S. President Donald Trump utilized these tactics as a private citizen, suing author Tim O'Brien for $5 billion over claims regarding Trump's net worth, a case that was ultimately dismissed but forced massive legal defense efforts. Similarly, fossil fuel corporations have repeatedly utilized SLAPPs to silence environmental activists. The organization Earthrights identified 152 instances between 2012 and 2022 where the oil and gas industry used SLAPPs and aggressive legal harassment to attack First Amendment rights and silence opponents.
The legal profession itself has recognized the severity of this exploitation. The UK's Solicitors Regulation Authority issued a formal warning notice in 2022 regarding SLAPPs, stating that solicitors misusing litigation to prevent legitimate scrutiny cross an ethical line and threaten the rule of law. This weaponization of rules also happens inside organizations in a much more subtle, passive-aggressive way. It's called malicious compliance. This is the act of following an organization's rules and policies to the exact letter, while intentionally disregarding their spirit or intent. This is a form of passive-aggressive systemic sabotage. Because the employee is technically adhering to the written policy, they are legally and procedurally shielded from traditional discipline, even as their actions intentionally cause massive delays, inefficiencies, or catastrophic failures. The lethal danger of rigid bureaucratic adherence is starkly illustrated by the NASA Challenger 1986 and Columbia 2003 disasters. In both tragedies, engineers identified lethal risks. However, the warnings were systematically suppressed by management because the engineers lacked the specific quantitative data required by strict procedural rules to justify delaying a launch.
the bureaucracy filtered the truth through layers of mandatory compliance and PowerPoint presentations.
No rules were technically broken, and everyone followed the established process, but the system's blind adherence to procedure resulted in the disintegration of the shuttles. This fatal bureaucratic catch-22 demonstrates how systems prioritizing compliance over outcome can be weaponized to diffuse responsibility and shield decision-makers from the consequences of their actions. Similarly, internal corporate grievance and human resources (HR) procedures designed to protect vulnerable employees from injustice are frequently hijacked by bad faith actors. Weaponized complaints are filed in bad faith, lacking credible evidence, to enact revenge, manipulate organizational politics, or silence whistleblowers. This abuse is rising globally across workplaces, courts, and professional regulatory bodies. Because HR systems are designed to process complaints impartially, bad faith actors can repeatedly trigger investigations against their targets. Organizations rarely penalize the abusers due to the high burden of proof required to establish malicious intent, fearing that punishing false claims might create a culture of fear that chills legitimate reporting. Thus, the system intended to enforce accountability becomes an instrument of systemic harassment. The economic scale of litigation and grievance abuse is staggering. In New York City, which the American Tort Reform Foundation ranked as the #2 judicial hellhole in the country, abusive litigation costs the state economy nearly $89 billion annually. This fraud-demic represents an industrialized scheme built on staged accidents and the abuse of statutes, demonstrating how organized bad faith exploitation can corrode public trust and extract massive wealth from the legal system.
The vulnerability of open systems doesn't stop at legal and bureaucratic frameworks. It extends deep into the digital infrastructure and scientific processes that we rely on every day. Let's talk about open-source software. The modern internet is fundamentally supported by it, maintained largely by small groups of volunteers acting in good faith. But this collaborative nature is a prime target for exploitation. In 2024, a backdoor was discovered in XZUtils, a ubiquitous Linux compression tool. A bad actor had spent years building a legitimate reputation as a volunteer, weaponizing the community's trust to quietly inject malicious code. If a Microsoft engineer hadn't accidentally noticed some unusual login delays, this hack would have granted unauthorized remote access to millions of servers globally. The system's openness and its reliance on good faith volunteers were the precise vectors for this attack. The same pattern appears in scientific publishing. The peer review process assumes that authors submit genuine research and that reviewers evaluate it honestly. But shadow organizations known as paper mills have industrialized scientific fraud. These entities mass-produce fabricated studies, manipulate data, and sell authorships to scientists who need publications for their careers. They bypass systemic defenses by bribing journal editors, establishing their own agents as guest editors, and coordinating fake peer review rings. The scale of this is massive. The publisher Hindawi was forced to retract over 8,000 articles due to compromised peer review and paper mill activity. These fabricated papers corrupt the databases used for vital drug discovery and medical research, all by exploiting a system built on the assumption of academic integrity.
This leads us to another critical concept from the analysis: the danger of enforced neutrality. When institutions face internal conflict or toxic behavior, leadership often defaults to a posture of strict neutrality. Think of corporate no-politics rules or journalistic both-sidesism. But the report argues this is rarely objective. Instead, enforced neutrality often becomes a mechanism to sanitize destructive behavior, protect the status quo, and shield bad actors from legitimate critique. Let's look at this in the context of corporate harassment. The legal and corporate frameworks designed to address this issue often rely on a twisted concept of neutrality that ends up protecting the perpetrators. Within corporations, human resources departments act as the legal shield for the company. Investigations are often outsourced to external law firms under the guise of neutrality and independence, but they are frequently used to manage corporate liability, suppress dissent, and build cases against the complainants. The investigative process itself becomes a tool of institutional retaliation. Furthermore, the culture of staying out of it, a neutral stance by bystanders, acts as passive complicity. The bystander effect diffuses responsibility, allowing toxic behavior to thrive. As research shows, individuals who claim neutrality on moral issues are often seen by their peers as conflict avoidant, strategic, and ultimately as amoral as those engaging in the negative behavior.
The illusion of neutrality also plays out in corporate policy. In recent years, several high-profile tech companies have tried to enforce ideological neutrality by banning political and social discourse at work. In 2020, Coinbase banned political activism unrelated to its core mission. The following year, Basecamp did the same. These policies were presented as neutral steps to prevent distraction and polarization. But what was the result? A mass exodus of staff, including high-ranking minority executives. The fundamental failure here is misunderstanding what neutrality is. Demanding that employees leave their political and social identities at the door isn't a neutral act. It's an enforcement of the dominant culture's comfort. And by silencing discussions on systemic inequality, the organization implicitly sides with the status quo. This weaponization of neutrality is brutally effective in digital communities. A seminal case study is the 2014 Gamergate controversy, a highly coordinated harassment campaign targeting female game developers and journalists was executed under the disingenuous guise of demanding ethics in games journalism. By cloaking misogyny and death threats in the respectable language of media critique and ethical standards, the bad faith actors forced platforms and media outlets to engage with their arguments as if they were legitimate. This tactic successfully weaponized the media's instinct for neutrality against the victims. This provided a direct blueprint for modern political disinformation campaigns. It proves that demanding strict neutrality from an institution forces it to validate bad faith arguments. This ties directly into the foundational philosophy of major social media platforms, especially early Twitter. It was famously described as the free speech wing of the free speech party, built on a principle of absolute content neutrality. This created an environment with no consequences for bad faith actors. Without robust moderation, the platform was rapidly exploited by violent extremists and for coordinated harassment. This leads to what's called adverse selection. When platforms refuse to moderate toxic behavior, good faith users who are targeted by harassment eventually leave. The platform is then left dominated by bad faith actors, polarizing the network and eroding social cohesion. This weaponization of neutrality has been disastrously effective in public science policy. For decades, bad faith corporate actors, particularly the tobacco and fossil fuel industries, have exploited the media's desire for objective neutrality, often called both-sidesism, to stall critical regulation. When the global scientific consensus was clear that smoking caused cancer, these industries didn't just deny it, they actively manufactured doubt. They funded their own neutral scientific papers and think tanks to inject skepticism into the public discourse. They demanded that their industry-funded skeptics be given equal time alongside legitimate scientists, all in the name of fairness. This enforced neutrality sanitized their destructive financial motives and elevated fringe bad faith theories to the level of established science. As a result, the public was denied accurate information, and vital policy interventions were delayed for decades. So, after 2 episodes, where does this leave us? We've explored the chaotic actor who thrives on disruption, and the vulnerable, good faith system that is so easily turned into a weapon. The key insight is that these two phenomena are two sides of the same coin. The chaotic leader is the predator, and the system built on passive tolerance is the prey. To build resilient institutions, you have to solve for both. So here are 3 actionable takeaways to do just that. First, shift from a passive assumption of good faith to a posture of active defense. Stop designing systems that only work if everyone is honest. Instead, build systems that anticipate bad faith actors. This means creating grievance frameworks that can distinguish between genuine concerns and weaponized compliance. It means having clear, predefined protocols for dealing with parasitic behavior before it can take root. Don't just hope for the best, actively defend against the worst.
Second, redefine neutrality. True neutrality isn't about giving equal time to good faith actors and bad faith actors. It's not about both sidesism when one side is arguing for the system's destruction. True neutrality means being fiercely partial to the system's core principles of fairness, integrity, and safety. It's about protecting the operational integrity of the system itself. This requires the moral clarity to identify and isolate destructive behavior, not the conflict-avoidant impulse to sanitize it under the guise of being impartial.
And third, implement structural consequences. As game theory shows, cooperation can only be sustained if there are real, immediate consequences for defection. A system that tolerates rule-breaking and unethical behavior, whether from a toxic founder or a manipulative employee, guarantees that such behavior will flourish. Consequences must be built into the very architecture of the system. This isn't about being punitive, it's about making bad faith behavior mathematically unprofitable. A resilient system doesn't just ask for good behavior, it makes any other option too costly to consider.
And that brings us to the end of our 2-part series on institutional failure. We've seen how chaotic leaders can dismantle systems from the inside out, and how even the most well-intentioned systems can be exploited by those same actors. The ultimate defense is a dual approach, rejecting the allure of chaotic, loyalty-driven leadership and simultaneously architecting resilient systems that are, as Popper argued, unapologetically intolerant of bad faith. Thanks for joining me on Mindcast. If you found this series valuable, please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Keep thinking, keep questioning, and above all, strive for fairness and truth.